Howdy my totally always tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video, and today we're going to be talking about some 7 out of 10 games. Now, the phrase 7 out of 10 video game has been around for many years. Reviewers and aggregate sites have been using scales of 1 to 10 forever, but the term 7 out of 10 really has gotten quite popular, it feels like, over the last few months and even in more recent years. It's a good way to describe that a video game is good, but it's not great. Sometimes it's even really good, but it doesn't reach that next level. It's not an all-timer, it's not a must-play, but it still is a good video game. It's not mediocre, it's not average, it's a 7 out of 10. And while I personally don't believe in giving video games numbers or scores or anything like that, I think numbers is just a really arbitrary way to rate video games. I'd much rather just recommend or not recommend. These are 10 games that I think are good. They're not great, they definitely have some flaws, and they're not going to wow you, but they're still solid experiences. They're good times, there is enjoyment to be had with these games, and they shouldn't be overlooked. Some of these games absolutely have been overlooked because, oh, they're 7 out of 10 games, why would I even bother with that? It feels like, especially nowadays, so many gamers won't even bother with a game unless it has like a Metacritic score of a 90 or higher. And they act like anything under an 85 is just garbage, it's a dumpster fire, don't bother. Well, I completely disagree with that mentality. Some of my favorite video games of all time are 7 out of 10 games. Some of my most played games of all time, they really are 7 out of 10 games. They're not great, but they're good at what they do, and they're still a fun time. And so, let's get to those 10 games. This list is in no particular order, it's just some favorites that came to mind. And please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Let me know some 7 out of 10 games down below. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of a solid 7 out of 10 game, one series that comes to mind pretty quick for me is Darksiders. I feel like Darksiders is just one of those quintessential 7 out of 10 series where all the games are good, but they're not great. They all have flaws, they all have pacing issues, and while they don't do anything revolutionary or innovative, they're still good times. I'm choosing Darksiders 3 for today's video. And while I know there are plenty of people who actually don't care for Darksiders 3 that prefer the style of the first two games, I did enjoy Darksiders 3. It is quite different from the first two. Instead of being like a hack and slash character action game, God of War, Zelda clone, it's much more like Dark Souls, and it has a lot slower, more methodical combat, but yeah, I still quite enjoyed it. The game has a pretty decently different story. It's about Fury, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and it's about her trying to catch the 7 deadly sins. The game still manages to create a unique atmosphere, a different kind of setting and world from the prior Darksider games, and yeah, it still does feel unique even all these years later. The story, it's not amazing, but it's fine enough. When it comes to the actual gameplay, yeah, it is more like a Souls-like, and it even has some Metroidvania elements rather than being just a straight hack and slash or having some big open world. This game is rather linear in comparison, and when it comes to the combat, yeah, it's certainly not as complex as the prior games, and it is a bit slower, but I still like it. The game actually does have a little bit of challenge to it, and there are some good fights here. There's even some good boss fights, but I could see why people would say that it is rather simplistic. You don't ever fight these huge waves of enemies, and the combat doesn't really ever evolve all that much, but again, it was still enjoyable. At least you actually get to really upgrade Fury. This game really focuses on making her stronger and stronger, and the progression is good in that sense. And when it comes to the gameplay outside of the combat, yeah, while it's not an open world, it still is like a continuous environment. All of the game is rather interconnected, and it is pretty linear. You'll be doing some simple, like really simple and basic puzzles, some basic platforming, and some minor exploration where you're interacting with the environment. It's nothing game changing, it's nothing crazy, and it's all just good. I feel like this game is a great example of a 7 out of 10 game. Everything is just good, and nothing really excels or becomes amazing or must see, but nothing's really bad either. It's just all a level of good. The combat, yeah, it's good. It's not great, but it's solid enough. The exploration and level design and puzzle solving, yeah, it's decent enough. The presentation, it's alright. And the story, characters, world building, all of that, yeah, it's decent enough stuff. Again, it doesn't really excel in any area, but the game doesn't totally fall apart either. It's just a solid experience that I think most people are going to be able to enjoy. I know that when it released it had a ton of bugs and glitches, but when I played the game a year or two later, it seemed to be pretty alright in that sense. The game doesn't reinvent the wheel, it doesn't ever try to reinvent the wheel, but what you have here is a more than enough enjoyable experience that I think fans of Darksiders will enjoy, and if you're looking for a game that doesn't blow you out of the water but still is a nice time. Another game that comes to mind pretty quick when thinking about 7 out of 10 games is Ty the Tasmanian Tiger. Yeah, there's been 7 out of 10 games for as long as video games have been around, and Ty is a great example. It came out in the early 2000s, back when mascot platformers were all the rage, and it's about this Australian, very Australian Tasmanian tiger. It's about him trying to rescue his family. The game was developed by Chrome Studios, an Australian studio, and they really went out of their way to make it feel as Australian as possible with the didgeridoos, the forests, the swamps. All of the locations are actually pretty great. The game is a pretty standard 3D collectathon. It's very comparable to Banjo-Kazooie, where you're dropped into these rather large environments and are told to collect a few things, and once you collect enough of the things, then you're able to progress through the game, go to the next level, get new abilities, etc, etc. Ty starts with a few abilities of his own, but as you play through the game, you unlock more and more and can do different things. There's actually a good amount of variety in the environments, what you're doing, and the game really does find a way to keep everything relatively fresh. The game looked nice for the time. It looks nice even nowadays, and the music, okay, the music actually does slap in this game. I really do love the music, but I wouldn't say that this game does anything particularly amazing outside of the music. The gameplay isn't exactly the most innovative or creative, but it puts a fun spin on things. The controls, they're fine enough. The level design, yeah, it's pretty decent. But overall, I would say the gameplay, really the entire game, is an enjoyable experience. It's not one of the best 3D platformers I've ever played. It's not one of the best platformers of the era. It's not this outstanding game that just totally blew me out of the water, but it was never trying to be that. It just tried to be a fun, quirky, memorable 3D platformer, and I think it absolutely is that. If you're looking for a fun platformer or you want to play an Australian game that isn't Borderlands the pre-sequel, well, this is a great one to play. So here we got another bit of a throwback. We have the game Singularity. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this one, it was actually developed by Raven Software and would be the last game they would develop before being saddled with the Call of Duty series. And it's actually a pretty solid first-person shooter that has become very overlooked throughout the years. I barely hear anybody talking about this game, and when they do, usually they have pretty positive things to say about it. While the game certainly isn't perfect, and it is a rather short experience, it still was an enjoyable one. It actually is all about time travel and centers around this time manipulation device, and basically history goes the wrong way, the wrong people win a certain war, and yeah, you gotta go back and change things. The story's actually decently interesting. It's a unique premise, and the way everything progresses, I think it's pretty alright stuff. I'm not gonna act like the plot's gonna win any awards, and the writing and dialogue isn't expert level, but I certainly enjoyed it. And when it comes to the gameplay, yeah, it's a first-person shooter from the early 2010s. Complete with a weapon limit, it being very linear, and it certainly looks like a shooter from the 2010s. It looks like that typical Unreal Engine 3 game, but it's aged pretty decently. Surprisingly though, you actually don't regenerate health. You have to use health pickups, so it's a little different from Call of Duty. Now when it comes to the gunplay, it's pretty decent stuff. All of the weapons have a nice kick to them. They all feel nice. The shotgun in particular, it does feel cool, but a lot of the gameplay really revolves around the time manipulation device. You can do blasts of energy, and you can actually affect the environment, and this can be used in combat. You can actually do some pretty cool stuff with this thing, and it is used for some very rudimentary puzzles. The game is incredibly linear, like very linear. It's really just move forward the entire time, kill all the bad guys, and do all the set pieces. But hey, at least there's some pretty good set pieces in here. There's some really cool fights, and I think the gunplay more than carries the game throughout its rather short runtime. It's only around 5 hours long, and there was multiplayer for this game, but it's long dead. So all in all, it's a pretty decent first-person shooter. It's got some unique ideas in the time manipulation. It is cool. I feel like it doesn't really reach its full potential though. I feel like if this game had a sequel, they could have gone absolutely hog wild and nuts with it, but we never got that, and Raven Software ended up becoming a support studio for COD, which is a shame. This game is good, it totally has potential to be amazing, but as it stands, yeah, 7 out of 10 is a great way to describe it. But this video is not just a bunch of old games, I got some modern games here. Also, here we have the Alone in the Dark reboot that came out earlier this year. Now, I know a lot of people really didn't care for this one, but I was actually totally picking up what this game was putting down. I was smelling what it was cooking. And while this game totally does have some issues and it lacks the polish that a lot of modern horror games have, I still found it an incredibly enjoyable experience. It is a real reimagining of that original game taking place in the 30s. It sees our two main characters, Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood, going to this spooky ass swamp house, this house in the bayous of Louisiana, looking for Emily's uncle when a bunch of, we'll just say, eldritch horrors show up. I will say, despite all of this game's issues, they totally nailed the vibe and the atmosphere. Like, they really nailed that shit down. It's really great when it comes to just the general setting and tone of this game. I was really digging it. When it comes to the story, dialogue, characters, acting, yeah, it was all pretty good. When it comes to the gameplay itself, it is a very traditional survival horror game, but you gotta remember Alone in the Dark really helped establish the genre in general, so it makes sense why it's so traditional. You'll be exploring around this mansion, solving puzzles, getting into some fights with some weird creatures, and doing a lot of backtracking. You'll be examining plenty of things, and you'll have to actually put your thinking cap on, but I like the puzzles in this game. The combat, while it is rough around the edges, is decent enough. It gets the job done, but I wouldn't exactly say it's amazing. The survival elements are pretty basic here as well. The level design at least is good, and the pacing, yeah, it's pretty decent throughout. Like many other games on this list, I wouldn't say this game is exactly innovative. It doesn't come to the genre with a bunch of fresh new ideas, but what it does pretty well. I wouldn't say the game has any glaring issues. Again, it is rough around the edges and the presentation can be a bit iffy at times, but I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. I like that you can play through the game twice and get some somewhat different areas, and there's even different endings. I think that if you like survival horror games, you're going to enjoy this game. You might not love it and you might have some issues with some things, but I think most people will like this one. Embracer certainly didn't though, since they shut the studio down since the game didn't sell all that well, so I guess we're never going to get a sequel to this, which is a shame. But at the very least, I would say this is one of the more overlooked games of 2024, and I think people are going to look back at this one decently fondly, at least I hope. So another game that came to mind pretty quickly when I was thinking of games for this video was Digimon Story Cyber Sleuth. Now when it comes to the Digimon games, I feel like it's really up and down. I feel like most of them are just kind of ruined by a few fundamental flaws and aren't very good games, but Cyber Sleuth is actually a good one. While it's not going to make you go abandon Pokemon forever and stake your life to Digimon, I still think that this is a pretty solid RPG and one of the better monster catching games I've played that doesn't have Pikachu or anything that looks like Pikachu in it. When it comes to the story, it's actually kind of unique. It takes place in the digital world and also in real life. It's a nice mix of the two, and it's about hackers doing hacker things, and that's all I'm really going to say, since the story really is a main focus here and it's one of the game's strengths. It's actually pretty good. I rather enjoyed the story and some of the characters, and it's got plenty of interesting points. It does take quite a while to actually get going, but once it does, oh yeah, it totally picks up and I really was enjoying it. When it comes to the gameplay, it is rather basic actually. You'll do a lot of investigating where you're talking to characters, examining the world, solving some basic puzzles, finding keywords and using those keywords with the environment or other characters, and of course getting into battles. When you get into the battle, it's a pretty standard turn-based affair where you take your turn to attack, they take their turn to attack. There are types and type advantages here, but it's not as substantial as, say, Pokemon. You're not going to be weak as shit if you're weak against the type, but it certainly helps and adds a little wrinkle to this gameplay because, yeah, the turn-based battles, they're not anything special. If you've ever played really any turn-based RPG, you'll know what to expect here. The game certainly doesn't subvert my expectations. I was thoroughly whelmed. And when it comes to the puzzles, interacting with the environment, and just the general level design, it really is nothing special. It's pretty basic stuff here, especially the level design. It's rather flat, mundane, and you just kind of go through it, even during these dungeons. What makes this game a bit better than just kind of average is actually creating the Digimon and the entire digivolving, de-digivolving process. This is actually pretty fun. It's not like Pokemon where it's just a straight evolution where it goes Charmander, Charmeleon, Charizard. You actually have to build that original Digimon and then you have to level it up a bunch to then make it the next Digimon. But what's cool is there's usually a bunch of options, and then those options spin off into more options, and then you can even go backwards and change it up. There's actually a lot of evolving and de-evolving in this game, and I found this actually rather enjoyable. This is easily the best part of the game. While the rest of the game is relatively average, I feel like this actually props it up to being a decently good game. It made it much more of an enjoyable experience, and every time I hear somebody talking about this game, they usually talk about the digivolving just because it is actually mad fun. You can have tons of different crazy Digimon, and you don't even have to do a bunch of grinding for this either. You can just put them in like the Tamagotchi world where they just level up and they get fed automatically, and yeah, that's pretty cool. You can even put the Switch in sleep mode if you're playing on Switch and they'll still level up. It certainly helps the pacing. Overall, I wouldn't say this is an exceptional RPG, but it is a pretty great Digimon game. It's one of, if not like the best Digimon game, and if you like this series, it is worth your time. So here we have a game I've been meaning to talk about for quite a while, and that is the Deadpool video game. Now, I got this back when it came out. I was really excited for it, and while I don't think it's a great game, I still think it is pretty good. It has certainly jumped up in price thanks to a certain movie, but it was a really entertaining game, that's for sure. So the game really is all about Deadpool. It is very true to the comics, complete with different voices in his head, him being in love with the Grim Reaper, and him breaking the fourth wall constantly, going after the developers of the game, High Moon Studios, and it's just really entertaining. Some other X-Men characters do show up here. Wolverine does show up and you smack the shit out of him, and yeah, if you like the comics, if you like Deadpool and the X-Men, I think you're going to enjoy the story. If you're a fan of Deadpool in general, you're going to like this game. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, I'll be the first to admit that it is rather basic and it's a standard affair. You get to use guns and you get to use melee weapons. The melee combat in this game is nothing special. It's a pretty basic hack and slash where you have a few different weapons and you just wail away on enemies. If you've played really any character action game from the last 15 years, it'll feel just like that. And the shooting, yeah, it's pretty basic also. I mean, it feels fine enough, but it doesn't ever feel particularly satisfying. The combat, it's just kind of there. There's not really any enemy variety, and you don't really need tactics. But at least there's some half-decent boss fights in here. This is when the game actually mixes things up. When it comes to the level design and what else you're doing in this game, it's very linear, it's straightforward, and there's just not a lot to it. There's not a lot of variety. There's not a ton of crazy set pieces that wildly mix up the gameplay or anything like that. It's all pretty consistent, and Deadpool himself makes fun of the game for being rather consistent and even almost repetitive at times. And really, speaking of Deadpool, that's why you're playing this game. You're playing it to hear Deadpool, you're playing to laugh at the game and see what kind of wacky shit he gets into, and that's the best part of this game. The voice acting, the story, the characters. It's an incredibly funny, entertaining game that really pays homage to the character and does him justice. This is one of the best renditions of Deadpool ever, and it really is one of the funniest games ever. At least I still think the game is pretty funny. Yeah, it's very immature, but when has Deadpool ever had the most intellectual comedy? I quite enjoy a number of aspects here, but it totally does fall short. I mean, the gameplay, it really is nothing special, unfortunately. Thankfully, it's a really, again, just entertaining experience. It's got a good pace throughout, and if you're somebody who likes superhero games and you haven't tried this one, well, I think you should check it out, once it's affordable again. $100 for this game? You gotta be kidding me. So here we have Binary Domain. I've been seeing this game on most underrated games or most obscure or overlooked games of the last 15 years for quite some time. It was developed by RGG, who have gone on to make all of the Yakuza Like a Dragon games, so yeah, they know how to make some really good shit. But when it comes to this game, while it does try to do a few unique things here and there, ultimately, I think it is a solid 7 out of 10, if not a little bit of a generic experience. It is a cover-based third-person shooter that at times very much does feel like Gears of War, and it sees you fighting a bunch of robots. It takes place in the far future where global warming has won, so most of the planet is just totally inhabitable. And we rely more and more on these robots, but sometimes they go rogue, sometimes they're controlled by somebody who doesn't have the best of intentions, we will say, and I'll just leave it at that. The story and premise is actually interesting, especially the setting. It is rather unique and it tries to do something different. I think the characters are actually pretty decent in this game as well. When it comes to that moment-to-moment gameplay, like I already said, it's a third-person shooter where you'll be taking cover, popping off shots, and taking out these robots. Something this game tried to do that was really unique was have this entire trust system where, depending how you interact with the characters throughout the game, whether it's in gameplay or in the story, they'll trust you more and more, and they'll be able to do more things as they trust you more. They'll be able to flank enemies, they'll have better tactics, and you can actually totally control them. The game wants you to even use a real-life microphone to control them, but unfortunately this just doesn't really work at all. And while this whole trust and consequence system is interesting and it tries to be different, I feel like they really are just kind of scratching the surface when it comes to this. It feels a bit underdeveloped, and it feels like they could have gone more in depth with this. But again, it's a unique idea. But again, it tries to actually do something different. It doesn't want to be just another Gears of War clone. It really does want to be something more, to have memorable characters that trust you and you get to really form bonds. There's different endings, and I'm surprised another game hasn't tried to do this, or they haven't tried this for any of their other games. Maybe it's because this game seemed to sell like total dog shit according to any numbers I found online. They're just all completely abysmal in this game. Yeah, there's a reason everybody says it's a total hidden gem. And while the shooting, cover system, and general level design aren't great, in fact it's pretty standard overall, I still think the game has enough of a unique setting and it has enough unique ideas that it does stand out all these years later. It's still a interesting little footnote in RGG's history, I'll say that at least. It is available on PC if you're interested in it nowadays, and yeah, I think it is an overlooked shooter that might be worth your attention. And so here we got a game from last year. We got Lego 2K Drive. I was decently excited for this one. It had been a while since we got a Lego racing game, and while I wasn't disappointed, I certainly thought this one could have been a bit better. At the end of the day, it was a solid 7 out of 10 racing experience. So this game actually does have a story to it, but it's more of a Saturday morning cartoon kind of story where you just want to be the best and there's a comically evil person trying to stop you. It's really just there. This game is obviously much more about the racing. When it comes to the actual gameplay, yeah, you're dropped into these relatively large open environments and you can just do a bunch of missions, whether they're races, collecting things, going through rings. There's plenty of missions to do in these open environments. There's plenty of challenges, mini games, there's collectibles, and like most Lego games, you can destroy pretty much everything. You'll just drive right through everything here in the collision. It actually is decent here. Something this game has that is unique is it is like Sonic and All-Stars Racing transformed, as in when you go over certain terrains, the car, or shall I say vehicle, actually does transform. When you go over the water, you become a boat. When you go over something bumpy, you become like a all-terrain vehicle like an ATV, and of course when you're just on the street, you're a normal car. I think this is pretty cool. All the vehicles feel a little different from each other, but they don't feel super different. The game actually does have a good sense of speed here. You do actually get some good speed, and I feel like the track design, yeah, it's alright. There is a bit of rubber banding AI, but I mean, it is an arcade racer, so what do you really expect at the end of the day? I like these environments, I like the racing, I like this game's general loops. The problem is that the game isn't very long. You can finish the single player campaign in like 5 or 6 hours, and then if you do like everything, maybe 10 to 15 hours at most, and then there's not much to do. The game also focuses on multiplayer where it has, you know, live service aspects, but the multiplayer, I just never really was digging with this game. I'm sure there's people actually playing it, especially since the game's been given away for free a few times. But the game certainly seemed to focus more on its multiplayer when I think the campaign was its biggest strength. The game has plenty of merit, and if you're looking for a fun little arcade racer, yeah, this is a pretty good one, especially if you've got little ones or you need something more on the casual side. Not everybody's into Gran Turismo 7 days of the week. Sometimes, you know, you want that casual little racing game, and this game can be that. And I really think this game is a great example of good, but not great. It certainly falls short in a few areas. But at the end of the day, the game is still totally worth your time. I know that 2K actually laid off a ton of people that worked on this game, so I guess they weren't too happy with the results. Again, I'd love to see a second one really improve on everything, but I'm doubtful. I also think selling this game for a full price certainly did not help it, but it's pretty cheap nowadays. So here we have High on Life, which is certainly a guilty pleasure of mine, and I'm sure plenty of people are going to disagree with me. Like the Deadpool game, I think this is a very entertaining experience, but when it comes to actually being a video game, it certainly falls short in a few areas. I'll just address the elephant in the room and say that this game's comedy is definitely not for everybody. There are plenty of people that find this game wildly annoying and would never ever want to associate with it, but I actually do find the comedy mostly entertaining. It misses plenty of times and it just isn't funny, and sometimes it's even cringeworthy, but other times it absolutely hits the mark and it's got me laughing my ass off. I feel like it's a decent enough ratio, but I laughed enough times to the point that yes, I would say the game is entertaining and I like the humor, at least sometimes. And the nasally voices don't exactly bother me. I do like Rick and Morty, so I guess I do have an issue. Well, outside of being unemployed. Speaking of, you can always like, share, comment, subscribe. Thank you very much. Anyway, to get back to this game, when it comes to the story, it's about aliens showing up all of a sudden who want to turn humans into drugs, and then it's up to our main character to go stop the leader of this alien group that's trying to take everyone out. The story, yeah, it's pretty basic stuff here, but there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of characters, and it very much is a story-focused game. Whether you like that or not is, again, going to depend on whether or not you find this game funny. If you don't, you're probably not going to like the story, the setting, the characters, really anything. At least when it comes to the presentation, I will say this is a very good-looking game. I love the environments and the aesthetic. There's a lot of creativity, and it looks just very different from any other first-person shooter. And speaking of, it is actually a first-person shooter. It is a rather basic first-person shooter, but that's what it is at the end of the day. You get a few different guns, all of which talk to you and have faces, but they all are different weapons. For instance, you have a pistol, you have a shotgun, you get a gun that is basically a needler from Halo, you even get Let's Do It, which is just a smart gun from Alien. When it comes to the actual weapons, while there isn't, you know, a ton of weapons in this game, they all feel wildly different from each other. They all have different functions, and the shooting it's okay. The gameplay, while it is rather simplistic, it gets the job done for the most part. The combat really though is nothing special. The enemy encounters, the boss fights, it's all just kinda there. Same goes for the level design and any gameplay outside of the combat. Like, it's not super memorable, but it's not poorly done or bad. It's just kinda there. Which is, in my opinion, a great way to describe High on Life's gameplay in general. It's there, it's fine, it gets the job done, but what you're really playing this game for is the laughs, is the world and the story, and I think all of that is pretty decent here. It lifts the game up to a solid 7 out of 10 experience that I think anybody should play if you find this humor funny. If you don't like the humor or the characters, just forget it, just play something else. So to end things off here, I have a classic. I have Armed and Dangerous. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this one, this is a rather obscure third-person shooter from the early 2000s. It was actually published by LucasArts, you know, Monkey Island, Star Wars LucasArts. That's pretty cool. And the first thing you'll probably notice when looking at this game is, man, is it ugly. Even for the early 2000s, this is a very crude looking game with primitive 3D. Like, it is not a good looking game. It was not for the time, and it certainly isn't nowadays, but I kind of like the ugly aesthetic. It kind of just adds to the charm and humor of this game even more. It very much is a humorous game and tries to parody Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and a lot of Monty Python. Actually, you get plenty of cutscenes here, and they're all just a total blast. When it comes to what the story actually is, well, it's pretty silly. The game is definitely, again, inspired by British humor, and it sees these 3 outcasts known as the Lionhearts trying to steal this legendary book of rule, but I'll just say a bunch of other stupid shit happens in this game, and it really doesn't take itself very seriously. The cutscenes are probably the best part of this entire game. When it comes to this game's comedy, it's incredibly underrated, and all these years later, it really is pretty funny. When it comes to actually playing the game, yeah, it's a really basic third-person shooter where you pretty much just walk forward and blast everything. I guess it's most comparable to like Serious Sam. You basically shoot everything that moves. The shooting, it isn't exactly great. It feels fine enough. The level design, it's just kind of there. It's big open areas, and the actual encounters, it's really simplistic shit here. You literally just aim and shoot. That's all there really is to it. There's a variety of weapons in this game. Some of them pretty standard, but there's some weird ass ones like the shark gun. Okay, the shark gun's actually pretty awesome. That's probably one of the best guns of any video game, where you shoot a shark into the ground and then it goes and hunts the enemy, and that certainly keeps the game more interesting. They even throw like a jetpack at you at one point. You got to rescue some people, but overall the gameplay, yeah, it's really simple stuff here. It doesn't try to do anything different or unique, and it relies on its weird weapons, wacky atmosphere, and crazy characters, and you know, it's pretty solid when it relies on that. It is certainly rough around the edges, and playing it nowadays, it has aged in a few areas like the controls, but I still find this game actually rather enjoyable. It's got a good pace to it, it doesn't go on too long, it knows when to end, and the ending, yeah, it's about what you would expect from a silly game like this. It's pretty old nowadays, and really the only way to play it is through Steam, as I don't even know if the Xbox version is backwards compatible, but it goes so cheap that like if you have an extra $1 or $2 for the next Steam sale, maybe you should check out Armed and Dangerous. And to be honest, I don't know if I'll ever find another scenario where I can talk about this game, so I'm taking it. This game's a classic for a reason. It is a very funny game, and I feel like it's more about the experience rather than the core moment-to-moment gameplay. It's just one of those obscure 2000s games that didn't really give a shit about current trends or what was popular at the time. It just tried to do its own stupid thing, and I love it all the more for it. It's certainly better than KSI's song. But with that, we're going to be ending the video. Let me know of some 7 out of 10 games down below. Let me know about any videos you want to see, but if you're going to comment, you can comment coffee. That's the secret code word for today. And yeah, with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye bye now.